join the webinar, they will be muted. If you've got any questions, though, you can send them to me on the chat or the Q&A. There should be a little box that you can type things into, and we'll get back to you either during the webinar at the end. We'll have a Q&A. We'll be running through the presentation. It should take between half an hour and 45 minutes. We'll see. We haven't done this one before, so I'm not entirely sure. And afterwards, there will be a chance for Q&A with our guests. So again, if you've got any questions for the Q&A, just put it on the Q&A or the chat boxes. I'll also, after the webinar, I will be sending around a copy of the slides and some relevant documents. That'll probably be later today or tomorrow, depending on how long it takes to get the recording of the webinar sorted. So I think that's everything from me for now. Our team today. So I'm joined by Susan Reeves, consultant at Compliance Management Services, or CMS, who we work with closely. They're a firm of city-based independent compliance consultants. CMS provides expert assistance to intermediaries in connection with general insurance regulation. So thank you for joining us today, Susan.
Thanks for inviting me.
Excellent. We've also got Gary Hibberd, who I'm sure many of you will have heard before on one of our cyber webinars. So Gary Hibberd's the Managing Director of Agenci, who are our cyber recovery partners. He's got a passion for all things cyber, which was sparked in 1985 when he began his career as a programmer. As a result of that passion, Gary's come on to become a renowned expert on ISO 27001 and GDPR. So thank you for joining us, Gary.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Looking forward to it.
I'm also right here next to me, I've got Andrew Kilgore, who I'm sure many of you will have either met or you will have spoken to at some point. Andrew is our Director of Broker Relationships. He's responsible for the development of Larega's core business offerings and increasing its UK broker footprint.
Sarah, hi everyone.
Great, guys, so that's just a little intro, and I'm sure many of you will have heard me on the webinars before, but in case you haven't, my name's Sarah. I'm the Sales and Marketing Manager at Larega, so I run all of the webinars and all things marketing here. At the end of this, I'll give you my contact details, so if you've got any questions or any feedback on the webinars, please let me know. So quick agenda about what we're going to be talking today. So Gary is going to be chatting a little bit about GDPR, what it is, why should we be thinking about it. And we're going to talk a little bit about data breaches as well. We've then got Andrew here to just do a very, very brief run-through of the cyber recovery product and how that ties in with GDPR. And then at the end, it's not on this agenda, but we'll do a Q&A. So we're going to kick off. Why should brokers be thinking about GDPR? And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Susan and Gary. And just to let you know, we're not in the same room together, so we might swapping between slides might be a little complicated today. But I'm going to. So Susan, over to you.
So why is it important that brokers are aware about GDPR at the moment and start thinking about it now? Basically, it's going to apply to all businesses, not just the insurance industry, obviously, but all our clients as well. So regardless of the size of the business, one of the big headline things that's being bandied around at the moment are the huge fines if you get it wrong, and it could be up to 4% of annual group worldwide turnover. So it's much more at stake than getting it wrong before under the data protection rules. One of the biggies is reputational damage. Obviously, if you have a cyber breach, getting that all over the newspapers or the trade press isn't great for reputation. And clients probably will be expecting you to give some advice on their exposure towards this, and so account execs and so forth need to understand the basics of GDPR and how it's going to change for clients. It's important to note that it's not just about sales and clients, it's also about everything within the business. So there are implications with your HR teams and your operations, as well as the technology and sales and marketing. So it's important that everybody in the company works together on this from different perspectives and to actually find out what the issues are relevant to the different departments in any organisation. And as well, if you're not speaking to us about cyber insurance and something goes wrong with the client's insurance portfolio, then there is a potential high risk if you're not bringing it to attention. So I think the next slide, if that's okay. So what is the GDPR? Well, it stands for General Data Protection Regulation, and it's going to update the data protection not just in the UK but across Europe. In 1998 was quite a long time ago now. In those days in the offices, when I was working, we were all using fax machines, floppy disks, things like that. And also only 6% of households had access to the internet in 1998. So quite a lot has changed. So it's time, with all the online shopping and all the information that's out there about all of us, that some of this information is locked down. So the GDPR will apply across Europe. There's no getting away from it, because if you're an organisation doing business with EU citizens, either offering services or monitoring, you'll come under scope of this, even if you decided to move outside of Europe. A lot of people think, well, Brexit's coming along, how is it still going to be applicable? But the bad news is, it is. The UK invested an awful lot of time and resource in working on this huge law change, but also it's going to be needed in the UK regardless of Brexit. And also, if we're going to trade with EU citizens, as I said earlier, then we need to be able to comply with the law. So it's not going to help us to get away from it, I'm afraid. And it's going to come in on the 25th of May 2018. A bit of confusion, because at the moment there's also the data protection bill, so people are getting a little bit confused as to how this fits in with the GDPR. Well, basically, it's writing it into UK national legislation. So after we do leave the EU, we will have all the legislation in place. And it also supplements the GDPR, because member states are allowed in certain factors to actually derogate from the rules and actually put some of their own rules in place. Things like how you're treating data regarding criminals and the age of parental consent for children and things like that are going to be different in different countries. So the data protection bill has allowed the UK to make it specific to the UK in certain areas, but at the moment it's going to operate in tandem with the GDPR. So now, so what is personal data? This is what it's really applying to, but it's anything that can identify any of us as a data subject. So some things like our names, our dates of birth, email addresses, they all come under personal data. But there is some confusion about email addresses, because are not what's called natural persons, but the people that work in companies are. So, for example, if you email a general email address like info@luriga.com or something, then that would not be personal data. But if you are sending unsolicited emails to Sarah Emma at Luriga, for example, then that would be personal data, and you would need consent to do that. As you can, that is an individual. Other things you need to consider are IP addresses. So obviously now with us all having mobile phones and being able to access websites, there's a lot of information about what we're accessing. So that will come under personal data as well. And also non-computer data, so any sort of records. You have paper records. So they've cited some examples here of books of names and appointments and so forth. One of the areas is, it's a bit difficult to say this one, but pseudonymized data. That is where some information is made to not be clear, sort of code named and so forth. But that comes under the personal data as well, if it can be unhashed and people can identify you easily. For example, you could have an identifier as being a user number or something like that, but with the information underneath, you can still identify who you are. So that would come under pseudonymized data. There is an example here. If you Google Zomato, that is an Indian restaurant search engine company, and that was one of the sort of headline data breaches that's been used this year. And basically they had hashed passwords, but because some people use the same passwords for different sites, they felt their security was okay, but because it was linked to the email address and the data was stolen, it was put up on the dark web for sale, then some other websites were using the same password may not have the same protection. So that was, putting people's data at risk. So there are some issues with using sort of pseudonymous data that you need to be aware of. I think Gary's going to talk about sort of the implications with brokers at this point.
Yeah. Thanks, Susan. I think at the bottom of the screen there, do your clients realise what data they're holding, and have they analysed the associated risks to processing it? It's a really good question. I often say that you can't protect what you don't understand. So we would urge the brokers to be asking their clients and asking themselves as well as to understand what personal data they are holding. Susan's given great examples there of what is personal data and some of the misconceptions that are coming about. So, clients, do you understand what data you actually hold, where is it stored, and how it's stored? Once you understand that, you can then start to progress to beginning to be able to protect that and understanding the risks to it. So over to Susan.
Thank you. So in terms of accountability, this is a big part of the GDPR. There's much more onus on companies, not only to comply with the legislation, but really to show how they comply. So you really need to do some sort of record keeping with audit trails and evidencing why you make the decisions that you do on a lot of the aspects of the GDPR. And you need to be able to explain things like, why do you need to process that data? So you have to have valid reasons for doing so, which I'll come on to in a minute. And also really consider how long you're keeping data for. There isn't a set period that you need to comply with, but you would need to be able to justify why you're keeping data for quite a long time if you were, and there certainly isn't a justification to keep data forever, so that needs to be really considered and discussed. You need to consider the implications for sharing with other companies as well, where we pass data on to third parties. That's you need to explain exactly why and the justification for doing that. But first and foremost, you need a legal basis for actually holding the data, which we're going to need to put in privacy notices. Now, there's actually 6 legal bases for processing data under the GDPR, but in the insurance industry, I'm going to focus on the ones that are really relevant to us. Firstly, is it with the consent of the natural person, the data subject? Is it in the legitimate interests of the controller? And that means, can we explain why we're doing that? But we would have to use a balancing test there, so that you can't put the interests of the controller above the individual. So we can't override the interests and rights and freedoms of a natural person, is the actual quote there. So, but there is some flexibility in being able to use legitimate interests. And finally, the other one that's really relevant to us is forming a contract as well. So you can justify under those 3 legal basis for actually holding data. Did you want to make a comment on that?
Yeah, thank you. It's a good point. Accountability is so important. Probably most people who have read the regulations, and I'm sure everybody on the call has, will know that there are 6 principles, and often accountability is classed as the 7th principle. Again, we, in a practical sense, we're asking our clients, and brokers should be asking theirs, are you documenting what data you hold? So once you've asked those searching questions about what data you have, are you documenting that, and can you demonstrate that you are holding that for legitimate purposes, for lawful purposes, and that you're only holding that amount of data that is needed for that particular purpose? So accountability and understanding that, I think, is really, really key.
Data. So this is there's some changes here. So we can, as data subjects, request our data, so we want to be able to see it, and that can be in a sort of a simple electronic format, which is commonly used. We can't put up barriers there, but also we could request it in writing as well. So there will be probably more people accessing, asking for to see what data we do actually hold. And there's a frightening example about Tinder, actually, where journalists, and if you Google this, you'll be able to see an article written in The Guardian, where the reporter, with the help of a data expert, asked Tinder to provide them with information, and it came back with 800 pages of data, and she was quite horrified to find that there was information that was linking to her Facebook account, so near her Facebook likes, links to Instagram photos and things like that, as well as all the different texts that she sent to the various people she'd met on Tinder. So a little bit frightening as to what's out there about everybody. So we need to be able to, that's an awful lot of data to have to send out to somebody. So there's quite a bit of work involved for companies to consider actually providing this access that people are going to request. So you really do need to think, how are you going to handle this? So you're going to need to train your staff. You're going to need to have the procedures in place and the policies in place so they can actually handle the requests within the set timescale, because it now must be done within 1 month. It was 40 days previously, but that's not a long time if you're going to have to collate quite a big file here. So that is something that you really do need to consider. You can also request that data gets deleted. So as individuals, we can do that, but there are some exceptions clearly. So you don't have to delete if we need to comply with a legal obligation. So, for example, with the FCA, we would have certain record keeping requirements. So we would need to. That would override the rights of individuals there, or exercising defensive legal claims. So when it comes to sort of claim-related matters and things like that, there are some exceptions to not have to delete all the information we have on clients. The other sort of key changes are that there's no fees anymore to be able to make a request for your data. Although if somebody's asking for the data again to go to a solicitor or something, then you could make a request, a fee for the second request. But we think this may lead to a greater number of people making access requests, because in the past they'd have to send a check and it would be some hassle. Now they can just sort of ask for that, and there's also more information that's going to be needed to be given as well. So a few more things to consider there. So over to you again, Gary.
Great questions that have been placed at the bottom of this slide. So I would urge all brokers to look at those questions. Again, ask it of yourselves within your own organisations, but of your clients. Those questions are very, very key. We know who to speak to if a client asks for all their personal data, or your customers ask for that information. How to them, and would you know to explain and be able to justify why you need to hold that level of data? The example that Susan provided, the Tinder example, is one that is very well known within the industry, if you like, but not a lot of people know it in the general public. And as I said, horrified to find out that all this data that is out there is being shared in ways that previously we possibly didn't consider, which is one of the reasons why GDPR is so important. It gives us all access to understand not just the data, but understand how it's being used and how it's being shared.
Let's move on to consent. That's obviously one of the legal bases that we mentioned earlier, but there is quite a lot of discussion on this. And at the moment, there was a consultation paper that went out from the ICO, and we're still waiting for final rules and guidance on consent. So some of this is a little bit up in the air. But in general terms, there will be much more focus on active consent. The definitions of consent has changed, and we're now going to have to ensure that consent is freely given, that it's specific, informed, and unambiguous, prominent, so that we can and easily withdrawn as well. So much more sort of focus on the active consent. You need explicit consent for sensitive data as well. You're going to need to really, again, to be able to record keep on this, and this is something I think you need to plan ahead for, is demonstrate that consent was given. So you're going to have some way of recording this, or if you're doing consent over the telephone, that it's recorded, that it's dated when the consent was given, and also if you are your privacy notice and what you're saying to the customers in terms of what they are given consent to needs to be kept as well, so that if there's ever a complaint, that you can actually justify that you were given the information and the consent to be able to use it. You can't hide anymore in terms of pre-ticked tick boxes that you need to untick, so it would need to be ticked rather than unticked. And you can't make the provision of a service relevant, dependent on getting consent as well, which I think, and a lot of companies will do that, particularly if you're sort of getting some sort of online subscriptions documents that you want to have access to often does make you consent to the terms. So that's going to have to change. Take care with one of the big things, especially with Salesforce and account executives, we go back to that point with taking email addresses from LinkedIn, because if you haven't got the consent to do marketing, then you may have a problem. You may have different leases as well. So if you're forming the contract, then that consent, that legal basis could be contract. But if you're doing direct marketing, it's more likely to be consent. So you need to be really thinking about exactly what you can and can't do if you haven't had the consent. If you've already got a privacy policy, mostly in terms of business things like that, you don't have to change it, but you do need to make sure they will be compliant with the GDPR. So if you were previously using tick boxes and so forth, you will need to change and reissue. But most people these days have been planning for these sorts of consent changes in the last few years, so a lot of people won't need to change it. Over to Gary again to talk a little bit more about that.
Thank you. The issue around consent, Article 6 of the regulation that Susan mentioned earlier, is there are 6 bases upon which you can lawfully process data, and consent is only one of them. When I'm speaking to organisations, of course, marketing is the area that consent is greatly involved in, and the rule changed around it largely because of the abuse that people have carried out using the data that they've collected for a number of reasons without permission, and they're using it for marketing and direct marketing and such. GDPR has been put in place to try and curtail those practices, which are not best practice, shall we say. GDPR obviously stands for General Data Protection Regulations. I often say to people it stands for giving data proper respect. What we should be doing is asking if the way we are seeking consent and the way that we're using data, is it open, is it transparent, is it clear, is it actively obtained? So when talking to your clients, you should be asking them about how they have obtained consent to use data and can they evidence it. If they can do that in a very clear and transparent way, then they are skating on thin ice.
Other significant changes is the existence, you've probably heard the term, the data protection officers that some companies will need to put in place. They're basically for public authorities and companies that carry out large-scale systematic monitoring of individuals or large-scale processing of special categories of data. They must have a DPO. So most brokers probably wouldn't need to actually have a formal data protection officer employed. You could use, if you do need to have one, if you're handling lots of sort of health insurance information or travel insurance, things like that, where there's health and it's been processed a lot, you may need to have one. You could use a person internally or use a third party. But most companies, as I said, probably wouldn't need one in sort of the insurance broking arena for most insurance brokers. But you may would have somebody that takes responsibility for data protection and keeps up to date with rule regs and also helps the team. But I would take care with actually calling them a data protection officer. Basically, there are some rules around data protection officers. So they first of all have to be supported. So it's important that they can report to the highest level of management and they get total support for that. They have to have their contact details published. And they can fulfil other duties, but not if they're conflicting, which when you actually look into that can become a little bit complicated. But they must not be penalised for performing their tasks. So there are some special employment issues around them that you will need to be aware of. So if you are making them responsible for protection, but they don't need to be a data protection officer, the advice from many employment lawyers at the moment is to call them something else for those reasons so they don't get the protection. But it is really key that anybody who is a DPO does have the total support of the board and that they are seen very important and that the staff understand all the issues around that. They need to be the point of contact for data queries, but also the point of contact for the Commissioner as well. So, Gary, I'll talk a bit more about this with brokers.
Again, the question there is a good question. Who is responsible for data protection in your organisation? And I hope questions that are appearing at the bottom of your screens now are questions that you're noting to ask yourselves, brokers, but also to take away and be able to ask your clients. Because Susan made a really good point there. It's about responsibility. Who is responsible for data protection in your organisation? You may need to have a designated DPO, given that roles and that responsibilities, because as Susan said, they will have definite roles to play, and the rules around what they can do or can't do and who they can and can't be are very well laid out in the regulations. But just bringing back to the very basic question, who's responsible? I'm amazed when I go and speak to organisations, and have been over many years, I ask the question, protection, information security is important to you, but who is responsible? And sometimes people don't know the answer to that question. Being able to answer that question is really key.
Gary said then as well that if you really, a business that are following data protection regulations, there's business practice, so there's not, in many ways, a huge amount if you're doing things right at the moment. There's just a sort of a few differences. But if you are having a data breach, what does that look like? Because it's going to be more important to be aware of these now. So a data breach, the actual definition is one that leads to the accidental or unlawful destruction, loss, or unauthorized access to personal data, and that can be many things from internal breaches. And the example we said earlier about Zomato was actually an internal breach where somebody was selling the data. So these things could be things like lost laptops. We've often heard about that in the news with politicians and so forth. And data breach could be in many different ways. So it can happen in lots of different ways. So really it is to do a bit of a risk assessment and think how this could happen. Do you need to do something with passwords? Do you need to put rules in place with staff if they're taking equipment outside of the building, or looking at linking to different coffee shop Wi-Fi's which may be unsafe? So there's one of the things we would do is really do a risk assessment, have a look at it, and think about all the different ways that data could leak out there. There's also a cyber threats webinar, I think, for Luiga. I'm not aware of that because I'm not from Luiga, but I'm sure Sarah could tell you how to find that in a moment. So at present, there's no set rules on notifying the ICO on a data breach, but they will be under GDPR. So basically, if the breach if it's a sort of a very minor breach where there's unlikely to be any effect, it's not necessary to actually report it to the ICO. But if it does result in a risk to the data subject, then you will be obliged to report it within 72 hours. And if it's likely to resist and a high risk to the individual, that needs to be notified to the individual. So if there's any sort of financial information leaking out or so forth, then there's a high risk, then it would need to be noted to them as well as the ICO. Gary, do you want to pick that one up?
Yeah, there's this point around is everyone in your organisation trained? It's around is there an awareness where everyone in your organisation would know who to talk to in the event of a breach occurring? An example I would give is an organisation I spoke to several months ago. They had, their head of HR lost her laptop, lost being that she left it on a train. The person she spoke to was the IT department, not because she saw that as a security threat, but because she needed a new laptop. It's not the computer, obviously, is a physical asset, and obviously there's a cost, but it was the data that was held on that machine that was of clear importance from a data breach perspective. So the training hadn't hit board level at that point, so everybody within the organisation from top to bottom needs to understand what they do in the event of a data breach.
As I said about the ICO notification rules within 72 hours and the potential fines. I think we've already addressed in terms of potential fine under GDPR. So Gary's going to pick up on the last paragraph.
Yeah, again, and I didn't want to steal the thunder from this particular slide because this is not difficult. All as brokers and as customers of brokers should have a incident management process, a business continuity plan, which says, which informs us what to do in the event of a data breach or a fire or a flood or some other calamity. So within that plan, we need to start to include actions to take in the event of a data breach. And it's a very simple process, but again, good questions there. Would you know how to report a breach to the ICO? Would you know what a breach looks like? Would you know what next steps would be? So if you understand those steps, then you'll be able to understand your client's exposure to potential fines, which hopefully wouldn't come down as hard as they could potentially come down if you have a clear process.
So much, guys. I thought that was absolutely brilliant. Just before we move on to Andrew, who's going to tell us just a little bit about cyber recovery and how this might tie in there. Susan, you just mentioned about the webinar. There was a cyber threats webinar that we held with Gary a few months ago. That's on our website. When I email everyone the documents after this, I'll make sure I include a link. So if you do want to watch that, it is available. But I'll hand over to Andrew.
Thanks, Sarah. As we listen to Susan and Gary, we all agree that the new regulations will mean it's even more important for your customers to have cyber insurance. And Larega's cyber recovery is a ideal low-cost solution for small businesses. Recovery provides and pays for the services of a cyber emergency response team to help your customers recover from a data security breach affecting their business. It also pays certain fines, penalties, awards, damages, cost of credit monitoring. Recovery is underwritten by Hiscox, who are market leaders in cyber insurance, and for a 24/7 claims helpline so that your customers can contact us when they need to. And there is a specific requirement for them to contact us within 12 hours of discovering a data breach during the period of insurance. A recent improvement to cyber recovery, for those of you who are already selling it, is that your customers are now covered for multiple losses up to limits of indemnity. So this chart summarises the 4 sections of cover. 24/7 crisis response gives your customers access to our cyber emergency response team, who provide an initial assessment of the risk and advise on the immediate actions they need to take. Incident management includes the provision of expert advice to ensure they comply with any requirements to notify the regulator and individual, as we've heard, along with investigation and expert advice in connection with third-party claims and expert PR advice to help protect the reputation of the business. Next, we have investigation and expert advice in the event of a regulatory investigation, assistance with restoring email systems, online services, and other software systems. These 3 sections provide over £30,000 worth of fees cover, which pays for the advice and assistance the customer receives from the cyber emergency response team. The final section of cover provides up to £100,000 for damages and related costs, along with fines and penalties following a regulatory investigation and the cost of credit monitoring for up to 12 months. There are a number of excluded business sectors, and using our Larega online quote and buy system or Acturis, this will be the first question as you start to process a quote, and so you will only be able to continue for eligible customers. We also exclude any data breaches occurring outside of the UK, and full details of all exclusions are set out in the policy schedule, which you can find on our website. Cyber recovery is available for businesses with a turnover up to £5 million, and our net pricing starts at just £50. As a broker, you can take commission of up to 30% on top of our net rates, and the product is processed very easily and accessed via our Larega online quote system and also via Acturis. So in summary, businesses, of course, as we've heard, have a responsibility to safeguard the data they hold, and businesses are facing an increased risk of cyber attack, which can result in a data security breach. That, in turn, can result in heavy fines, potential business downtime, and potential damage to their brand and reputation. Cyber insurance can provide the peace of mind and practical help that will allow your customers to recover from a data security breach. At the Rager, we have a nationwide sales team, and if you want to find out more about these products, please let us know, and we can arrange for one of our business development managers to call in to see you to talk through the details. Let me just touch on our expert services as well. So we also provide a range of assistance and support services on a fee-paying basis, and these are delivered by Gary and his expert team. So this includes help for customers who've experienced a data security breach but don't have our cyber recovery policy in place, and so may need to pay for that support. But we also offer help and assistance for customers simply wishing to improve their cyber security and protect themselves better against a cyber attack or a data security breach. So if you have any requirements along those lines, please send us an email or just a question, and we can put you in touch with Gary and his team, who can provide a lot more information and advice on what they can do.
Wonderful. Thank you, Andrew. So yeah, just a little brief overview of the product, but as Andrew said, if you do need any more information, just get in touch with us, and I'll be sending out some of the documents on that product. Thank you to all the presenters today. I thought that was fascinating. Scary, but fascinating. I'm going to open up for the Q&A, so we've got a chat box and a Q&A box. Please just drop me a message at Sarah Mawson, the host. If you want a question, I've got a couple to run through while you're thinking of your questions. I think this was probably one for Susan. If we need certain information in order to respond to a client request for a quote, do we need documented consent to hold that, or is it not needed because there is a contractual need?
A quote, you would have, I missed the very beginning of that question then, so it went a bit fuzzy. So did you repeat that?
I'll read the question. It says, if we need certain information in order to respond to a request for a quote, do we need documented consent to hold that, or not needed because there is a contractual need?
It would depend on how you decide on the basis for you processing the data, but you don't need to do, you could actually read through the privacy notice over the telephone. It doesn't have to be written consent, but you can actually discuss that with a client as long as you record that they've got consent. But if you're using it to form a contract, then you could use contract as a reason, as a legitimate reason for processing the data, but it depends what you then do with the information. So if you're then going to send them information or so forth, then there are other issues there, but you certainly don't need to have everything documented or signed that they give you consent. It can just be over the telephone, and there is quite a lot of guidance on the ICO website about privacy notices. How you can do that in a layered approach. So you could put something on your website, or you can tell some of it over the phone but then send them information later. So I would refer people to really sort of have a look at the ICO website, because there are some really great guides on those sorts of issues. Hope that answered the question.
Great, thank you. Here's one for Gary. In your experience, because you spend a lot of time actually dealing with cyber security and breaches every day, what are the sort of most common breaches that you're seeing, or how are those occurring?
The common breaches, and I think it's a well-known stat, is it's internal error. It's error. People leaving laptops on trains, emailing the wrong company with personal information, and it's errors. So it's not the actors we keep hearing about on the news or the hacker groups. It usually is just the person who hasn't been trained in the correct process and the correct use of data.
Thank you. Thanks, Gary. And then one, I think this is probably for Susan again, we touched on consent and documenting that. How would it work if you were given a business card? So, for example, if you're at the BIBA or Broker Expo conferences and you collect business cards from brokers or insurers, whoever it is that an implied consent to that data?
You would just basically record record why you've done that they gave you the email address and asked you to call them, so I don't foresee any problem with that. But just keep records of why you are emailing people. I think the ICO, they're not, the GDPR is not meant to sort of stifle business. It's just really meant to protect things from all this data that's being sold and all that sort of thing. So if you're kind of using a common sense approach, that should be fine.
Great.
Can I just back it up on that point? It's an interesting question. We get asked that question quite a lot about biz cards and networking events and such, and liking it to being the deck of the Titanic. You're worried about the ice cubes when you miss the big iceberg that's right in front of you. So worry about the iceberg first and take a common sense approach to it, and then we'll worry about the ice cubes and the little problems such as the odd business card. But as Susan said, if somebody gives you a business card, your first point of contact with them would be you give a business card to contact you about such and such a service. I'd love to stay in touch. Let's have a meeting. But that's way down on the list when I'm asking organisations, how much data you hold. Turn around to us and say between 5,000 and 50,000 records. I really understand the data they hold.
Yeah, great point. Great. Thank you. We haven't had any more questions come through on the chat yet. I'm going to give it a couple of minutes just in case there's anything else. So what we're going to do now is I will be emailing the documents and the slides over, as I said, probably this afternoon or tomorrow. So you'll have my email address. If you'd like to send me an email now, it's smorton@rega.com. Any questions, if you want to speak to the sales team, I can put you in touch with the relevant member of the sales team. I'd just like to say, where you signed up on the website, we have another webinar coming up later this month, which is on the loss recovery product. That's around winter claims examples. So if you'd like to sign up, that'd be brilliant. We'd love to see you on there. And if we don't have any other questions, I think I'm going to leave it there. I'm just going to say again, massive thank you to all of the presenters today for your hard work. And good everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Sorry.